In the last lecture module, we looked at the cases of Samantha, Casper, and Maud. All of these cases had a common element to them. They were essentially mere Gettier cases. Remember, in Gettier cases, the Smith character is making an inference, and that inference is normally grounded in some relationship between evidence or relationship in the world. However, in the particular case that Gettier asks us to consider, that relationship gets violated. The underlying basis of Smith's inferences is undermined in that particular case, and Smith does not know that to be the case. Thus, we think Smith is justified because from Smith's perspective, he's using a perfectly legitimate inference strategy, but from our perspective, he doesn't know because that inference strategy is faulty in that situation. In the Casper, Samantha, and Maud cases, we have a perfectly reliable inference strategy that works faultlessly. However, each of these individuals has massive cogent evidence that there is something wrong in that particular circumstance. And as a result, BonJour wants us to infer that they are not justified, despite the fact that they're using a process that would seem to generate a justified belief, other things being equal. In other words, in each case, we're being asked to project a metacognitive appraisal of the reasoner's situation onto them and make a judgment about the relative justifiedness of their beliefs in light of that appraisal. In the case of Smith, everything seems good, and so we are invited to infer that Smith is justified. In the case of Samantha, Casper, and Maud, we're invited to conclude that from their own subjective perspective, they're being irrational and irresponsible, and hence they are not justified. In this case, the norm case, we see a different situation, because in this situation, there are no massive amounts of cogent evidence either against the process or against the belief itself. Norm generates that belief, forms that belief presence in New York City using the perfectly reliable clairvoyant power. But Norm doesn't have any other beliefs or data for or against either that belief about the president's whereabouts or the reliability of his clairvoyant power. And in this case, I think our intuition that Norm is being incredibly irrational, it just doesn't follow. And so when we think about this case, this is actually the case that corresponds to Armstrong's use of reliability in his own theory. So if we're really addressing Armstrong, right, Armstrong's view is that we get non-inferential perceptual knowledge through reliable belief-forming mechanisms. So this is the case that describes or is analogous to Armstrong's use of reliability in his own theory. But the intuition here doesn't seem nearly as strong. And we might now think about, why is it that we went through these other cases? Well, these other cases seem to be more likely to generate that intuition that the reasoners in these cases, Samantha, Casper, Maud, they were all behaving irresponsibly and irrationally. They were ignoring massive cogent evidence against their belief or the reliability of the process with which they formed their belief, and so on. And all of those things are absent in this case. What I would suggest is that what BonJour has done here is employ what Daniel Dennett refers to as an intuition pump. He doesn't start with the cases that he actually wants to argue against. Instead, he starts with cases that he can use to generate an intuition. Then he modifies the cases slightly, working his way towards the case that he's actually trying to target, trying to pull that intuition towards the actual target case by generating it with these other cases and using that intuitive inertia of those small modifications to try and get people to have that intuition in the final case, the actual case that he needs to object to. He does offer up a couple of arguments for why it is that Norm is in fact being irrational and irresponsible. When we think about this case, when we're trying to analyze the Norm case, it seems contentious to claim either that Norm's belief about the president via his perfectly reliable clairvoyant power does or doesn't intuitively constitute knowledge. And I think BonJour actually agrees with this. He recognizes that there isn't a strong intuition in these cases. he immediately offers an argument that Norm doesn't in fact know that the president is in New York City. BonJour asks the reader to consider two distinct but similar versions of the Norm case, and these distinct but similar versions are both really reversions to the previous iterations of the case, and that don't in fact satisfy Armstrong's use of reliability in his theory. In the first case, Norm has a prior belief that P is a reliable process, and this belief plays a role in his forming his belief about the president's whereabouts. But, BonJour interjects, suppose that that belief about his reliable clairvoyant power lacks justification. Now, if the belief plays a role, then it is not by definition a non-inferential belief, and therefore it doesn't satisfy Armstrong's criterion for when reliability generates knowledge. And so again, this doesn't work as a counterexample to Armstrong's case precisely because it's not one of Armstrong's cases. In fact, it's hearkening back. It's trying to generate other beliefs that he can use to cultivate an intuition of being irresponsible and irrational. What about the second case? Well, in the second case, we got this situation where he ostensibly has no beliefs about his clairvoyant power. BonJour then claims, in this case, from Norm's standpoint, there was apparently no way in which he could know the president's whereabouts. It's as though it's completely mysterious to him, and hence he would be irrational and irresponsible to hold that belief in light of having formed it with his clairvoyant power. So here we see that introduction of this metacognitive appraisal being necessary for any justification that we saw in BonJour's coherence theory. This idea that unless you know what process is generating your belief and you evaluate it against the backdrop of your larger body of evidence while forming the belief, that you in fact aren't in a position to be justified. But this claim is the claim that he should be defending. This is the claim that should be the source of the intuitions. It shouldn't be that BonJour has to manipulate these cases. We should have these intuitions without those manipulations. In the next lecture module, then, we'll turn our attention to seeing if we can defend the reliabilist against the kinds of objections that BonJour raises in these cases.